We'll now proceed with our final speaker of this morning's session, Stephen Treacy. I'll hand over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Brian. I think this clicker is supposed to give me the presentation up. There's nothing happening here. Oh, here we go. Thank you. So look, I'm going to just present on the greenhouse gas projections that were published this morning. So you'll have probably seen some of the media already on it, and I'll just give you a rundown and take a few questions afterwards on the detail of this report. So first of all, just the key highlights, and as Laura has highlighted already, urgent implementation is the key message that we're saying here. We've a significant target to reach, a 51% reduction by 2050 from the Climate Act. We're seeing two scenarios here that in both cases need further work to get to that level. So we're needing to implement plans that we have and look at new measures as well. We're saying that we can meet the EU commitments over the 21 to 30 period, the existing commitments. There will be new commitments shortly under the Fit for 55 package. But the existing commitments are, with these scenarios, dependent on implementing all the policies and also on quite challenging targets, like we see, for example, rewetting and 8,000 hectares a year of afforestation. So there's a lot of ambition in meeting that. It's by no means a given. We also are just highlighting the fact that we need greater clarity on some measures. Also, I'll be illustrating that some measures are not in our projections that have been flagged in the Climate Action Plan yet, where we need more detail. And this is particularly an issue with the agriculture sector, where, because methane reductions are expected to play such a large role, we really do need more detail on how they're going to be achieved. So just to summarise the EPA role, we have quite a lot of roles in climate, and I've kind of listed a lot of them there. This is the output of the Emissions Inventories and Projections team, which is in the Office of Environmental Sustainability. But also we have climate science, climate research in that programme, and a number of other activities such as emissions trading and various other roles. And the EPA has the lead responsibility statutorily for projections and inventories, but we do have a lot of other actors in this. So we have a lot of data coming into us, and modelling work coming in from SCI, from ESRI, from Chagisk, and lots of departments involved in agreeing assumptions and understanding the savings that might be achieved. So it's a very much a collaborative process. So I'm just going to go through the introduction and highlights piece, and I'll talk a little bit about WEM versus WAM, then get into the carbon budgets and climate action plan, EU targets, and then the sector highlights. First of all, just I know we showed this around a fair bit, so I thought it was as well to spend a minute explaining it. The difference between the two scenarios we're using. The existing measures scenario is measures that are committed to and considered implemented at the level they can be considered implemented based on resources put in place. So for the most part, we're talking about measures that are in the National Development Plan at the moment, where money has been set aside for these things. For an example would be, say, the carbon tax as well, where the measure has been committed to increase the carbon tax to 200 euros per tonne by 2030, and we're seeing the annual increases happening in the budgets now. So that's an implemented measure. On the additional measure side, it's a combination of new things, because they're only implemented if they have been in the latest inventory year, which in this case is 2020. So post-2020 measures won't be in by default, but even when the year comes along, the level of implementation depends on what resources are behind it. So for example, there's a 944,000 EVs in the additional measures scenario. The implemented scenario, which is based on the NDP, is about half that, so about 500,000 EVs. So just to give you a summary of it, it varies from measure to measure what level of implementation is in one scenario versus the other, and some scenarios are only in one or the other. I should say the WAM scenario does by default include everything that's in the existing measures scenario, the WAM scenario. So the highlights here, we're talking about planned policies and measures being able to deliver up to a 28% emissions reduction. So that's the WAM scenario by 2030 versus 2018. And this is a comparison with the Climate Act. So this is the full amount, this including land use emissions, LULUCF as we call it. And the implemented scenario is about a 9% reduction over that period. So it's quite a gap between the two, which is something we've highlighted. we do need the use of the flexibilities and implementation of all the measures in the Climate Action Plan to achieve the existing EU targets. And the implementation gap, as we've highlighted all along, it comes back to what the IPCC authors have been saying, and Jim Ski said about the 1.5 degrees. It's now or never. Without immediate and deep reductions across all sectors, it will be impossible to keep the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So just a comparison on a slightly more detailed basis between these projections and what's in the Climate Action Plan. You'll see that the lower end of the range, so on the rightmost column there, you can see the range of emissions reductions that the Minister spoke to this morning, 22 to 30 for agriculture, 42 to 50 for transport, etc. And we are seeing that there is a broad convergence around the lower end of the range for most sectors. Now, I will go into the next slide with a little bit about what isn't in our projections, which will make up some of the gaps here. But I think it's fair to say that to get to the higher end of the range, we will need more measures to be uncovered. But that shouldn't slow us down from implementing the measures that we already know about, the existing plan. So really, we're talking about, as you see down the bottom, the 28% versus 51%. There's quite a difference if you compare including or excluding LULUCF, and I think the Minister also highlighted the challenge there. The additional measures scenario has a lot more measures on LULUCF, but even with that, we're still seeing that it will be a 20% increase in LULUCF emissions, and that is to do with a number of things, one of which is the revision to the emission factor for forestry on peaty soils, on organic soils, which has highlighted that there's far more emissions associated with planting there than would have been previously known. And that is something that really highlights not to plant trees on those kind of soils because it won't deliver a positive climate outcome. There's the big difference between the two scenarios there for LULUCF is largely as a result of two measures. So the water table management on agricultural organic soils of about 80,000 hectares. So these are agricultural land on those kind of peatland soils. And then also the afforestation. So there's a much bigger afforestation, 8,000 hectares a year in the WAM scenario. This is what I was just suggesting. There's a number of measures in the Climate Action Plan that for one reason or another, and there's different reasons, cannot be brought into the projections yet. That's not to say they won't make it in the future. The first one, the accounting for forestry removals post-2030, that's a bringing forward of savings that are expected to accrue post-2030, and that's fine for the plan, but in the context of what we're producing, projections to meet the requirements of EU guidelines, EU reporting guidelines for projections, it's not possible to bring those into the projections framework that we use at the moment. We may be able to incorporate that into national publications in the future, but it doesn't fit in our template, if you like, for now. Measures aimed at achieving potential savings from embodied carbon, these are examples of measures that we just need more information about how exactly they're going to happen. What's going to be the corollary to that? Is it going to be a reduction in cement plant emissions, or how exactly it will translate? Some emissions reductions don't impact the inventory directly because they're Scope 3 emissions, for example, don't necessarily impact on the inventory directly if a lot of the products are produced abroad. So there's really just a bit greater understanding needed of how that impacts in the Irish situation. CCS is not included mainly on the grounds of the timing. It's identified as being most likely post-2030 for implementation, and it hasn't been proven at scale yet, so there's a great degree of uncertainty there. Unallocated savings then, there's nearly 5 million tonnes in total between transport and general of unallocated savings in the plan that are to be identified later, and until they're identified we can't bring them into our projections framework, so there's a bit more work to do there. So those ones there account for in or around 10 million tonnes that are not in our projections but are in the plan. As I say, part of it is more work to do for us in talking with the various stakeholders and departments to understand what's being planned and how it might feed in. And part of it is just a need for more clarity from departments on what those measures actually are made up of. Looking at the Climate Act target, so this is, bear in mind, the first time we've been directly comparing with this 51% target. We'd only come in last year. And that is the comparison. So you see that big gap there between the WAM projections total and the WEM projections total. That's the gap that needs to be addressed in terms of the planning. The gap under the orange line is the gap that needs to be addressed in terms of implementation. in order to meet the 51% target. And of course, that target is designed to be met via carbon budgets. And on the next slide, I will show you the carbon budget picture, 3 carbon budget periods. And at the moment, we are projecting quite large exceedances for each of the 3 periods. So for the first period, the WAM scenario exceeds the carbon budget by about 40 million tonnes, the WAM scenario by 55. Second budget period, the WAM scenario exceeds by 77 and the WAM scenario by 127. And in the third budget period, it's a 94 million tonne exceedance for the WAM scenario and 166 million tonne exceedance for the WAM scenario. So quite big exceedances. We can, obviously this information is in the report in terms of the numbers. It just illustrates, I guess, that there's more to do here still. Compliance with the EU targets, and again, I just reiterate, these are the existing EU targets, the effort sharing regulation. What comes out of the Fit for 55 is likely to be more challenging than this. So we are seeing, and I suppose the most relevant comparison there in some ways is the additional measures scenario versus the purple dotted line in the middle, which is the annual emission allocations, which are set in law. That's what we have to achieve, with an adjustment for the flexibilities that we're allowed to use. There's 2 flexibilities, one around ETS and one around LULUCF. And with the use of those, to the extent that we can use them, it looks like we're just about potentially able to comply with the current plan measures that we have in the projections. Obviously, the blue line is a cause of concern at the top because that's the existing measure trajectory. And what I should have said at the start here is that the scope of this, so you can see the numbers are lower on the left-hand side, is not the same as the scope of the national plan. This excludes LULUCF from the targets and excludes ETS, so all the big power stations, big energy generators that are in the emissions trading scheme, they're not part of the effort sharing regulation targets. So that's where we're at. So it's quite a close thing, even with the additional measure scenario, and quite a big gap with the existing measure scenario. The point on LULUCF, I think it needs to be made. The effort sharing regulation allows us to use 26.8 million tonnes theoretical maximum flexibility for LULUCF. In previous years, prior to the new research I've mentioned on forestry and peatland soils, we would have assumed being able to use that. What that is maxing out at now with the new emission factors and new research is closer to 7 million tonnes, 6.7 to be precise. So really, the flexibility is not as available to us as it was in the past, and that is incorporated in those numbers, and partly why it's so close. Moving on then to, this is probably our third base period in this report, so apologies for the confusion there. There's a lot of different targets that are being looked at. So really here we're just looking at the trends, both overall and by sector. So first of all, the overall trend, and this is just emissions, total emissions as most countries term it, which does exclude LULUCF, but includes everything else. So what we've seen in 2021, when we talked about a projected 6% emissions rise in 2021, that's what we're seeing there. And you can see obviously the drop in 2020 in that as well, driven by the COVID impact. So I'll go into that in the sector detail, but that's what we're projecting. And 2021 largely being driven by rebound effects and coal use. For the emissions, for the existing measure scenario, we're projecting being out at 53 million tonnes by 2030 and 42 million tonnes in the WAM scenario from in or around 60 today. I should just point out you have the annual reductions there as well. So it's about a 4% per year annual reduction from here on, and 2% per year annual reduction from here on to 2030 in the WAM scenario. So obviously we're aware that the Climate Act target was expected to be somewhere around a 7% annual reduction on average, depending on the pathway. Looking at the comparison then between the different sectors and how they're likely to evolve between now and 2030, you can see that sectors that are going to decarbonise less or be slower to decarbonise are obviously going to increase in their share, and vice versa for sectors that are decarbonising more quickly. So, for example, energy is projected to go from about a 15% share, this is energy industries, mostly power generation, to about 10% in 2030, and that's a lot of that to do with added wind and renewable energy. Agriculture going the opposite direction because the target itself is a bit lower, but also this is the existing measure scenario where those methane measures are not included. And then similarly for transport, going again a bit slower than, somewhere between the two, a bit slower than energy and a bit quicker than agriculture, expected to go increase in share to about 19.7, nearly 20% by 2030. So I'll focus on the key sectors now. For the two scenarios for energy industries, as I said, this is largely power generation, but there are a couple of other pieces in there. But it's mostly driven by renewable energy targets. So both scenarios are quite ambitious here. So with the existing measure scenario, it does include about 3.5 gigawatts of offshore wind. The additional measure scenario has the full 5 gigawatts, along with 2 gigawatts of storage and other measures that are in the climate action plan. So it's a lot in there, getting up to around 80% renewable energy by 2030. The existing measure scenario, I should just say, and both scenarios do include Greenlink and Celtic interconnectors, so 2 new interconnectors, and also the end of coal by 2025 and the end of peat in 2023 when the planning permission for co-firing at Eden Dairy runs out. For the agriculture sector, as I've touched on this already, the additional measures scenario here, this is basically assuming the achievement of the lower end of the trajectory in the climate action plan, so a 22% reduction compared to 2018. That's the same as 20% from 2020 on. And in the existing measure scenario, there are relatively few measures. So the bulk of the climate action plan measures are not in the existing measure scenario, with the exception of low emission slurry spreading and some dairy crude protein percentage reductions that are factored in. But the bigger nitrogen measures, like the fertilizer cap that's being proposed, and a kind of a move from to stabilised urea fertilisers from CAN and straight urea, that's in the WAM scenario, but not in the WEM scenario. So really, what we are seeing here is in 2030 itself, over 3 million tonnes of savings to come from something that hasn't been fully spelled out in the plan yet, but is understood to be largely methane measures. Now, we do know that there are a lot of methane measures being proposed. They're detailed in the Ag Climatised Plan, the Teagasc MAC, but actually spelling out how it's going to deliver that reduction in that time frame is not clear yet. And it could be an up to 30% reduction in methane, as Laura said at the start, over that period. The transport sector, in the existing measure scenario, as I said, we have the NDP level of EVs. In the additional measure scenario, it's the climate action plan. So broadly speaking, roughly 500,000 versus 1 million EVs. That's the key difference between the two. And there's the reductions. You can see almost a 30% reduction in the WAM scenario. The reason why you have an increase in the WAM scenario is basically, if you look at the graph from 2020 to 21, there's a big rebound. We had a 16% reduction in 2020 during COVID with the lockdown. Probably one of the most expensive mitigation measures that you could have. But that has resulted in a comparison with 2020 and 2030 being an increase rather than a reduction, which would have been compared to the previous trend. But there are, in the WAM scenario here, in addition to the EVs, because EVs alone won't solve the problem, we do have demand reduction measures in there too, such as 10% reduction in ICE travel and other things that are spelled out in the climate action plan as well. Residential sector, I'll kind of speed up a little bit because I'm conscious of time here. We have a big reductions in both sectors, but again, be conscious that 2020 was actually a high year in this sector because of working from home. There was more emissions in this sector in 2020, so the decreases might seem bigger than they would compared to the general trend. But there's a lot of ambitious measures in here. There's 680,000 heat pumps, for example, in the additional measures scenario, 500,000 retrofits. Huge task, obviously, to achieve all that. And yeah, in comparison to the existing measures scenario, that it is mainly that greater uptake of heat pumps, and also things like district heating and biomethane use that are making the difference. Commercial and public services then, Scenarios are generally quite close. There's a couple of additional measures in the WAM scenario. I would just caution that sometimes the WAM scenario can go an unforeseen direction. It's generally due to how the modelling dictates availability of biofuel at different pricings. So pricing has an impact on what the uptake is. And in the WAM scenario, you've got a lot more biofuel being taken up in other sectors before it gets available to the commercial sector. So look, that's a bit where the orange line dips below the blue line in 2022 or 3. It's a bit of a modelling outcome, which it's worth highlighting that there are limits to how much at a certain price level is going to be available, and that's something that we also need to be aware of. In terms of the outcome then, I suppose the big reductions here are largely related to the same kind of measures we saw in the residential sector, efficiency and retrofitting measures in the main. Finally, I will just skip through the remaining sectors. I know they're still quite substantial. So the first two here, manufacturing, combustion, and industrial process emissions, are largely what is classified as enterprise in the Climate Action Plan. Manufacturing combustion emissions, again, following what we would have seen for the previous sectors. We've got efficiency measures here and biofuel uptake. So that's really what's driving the decrease, quite related to large industry programs. Industrial process emissions are increasing, and they're more difficult to mitigate in the sense that they're the outcome of a chemical reaction, and that's largely cement driven. So it's due to cement, projected increase in cement production. And the waste sector then, we are talking about the reduction in waste going to landfill, which reduces landfill gas, which is what's driving the emissions reduction there. F-gases are also in the plan. They're considered part of enterprise, but there is a lot of residential elements as well to that. And they're higher in the additional measures than the existing measure scenarios. That's got to do with the fact that there's more heat pumps in the additional measure scenario which use F-gases. So there's a knock-on effect on other sectors for some measures. And similarly with electricity, with EVs, you would have an increase in EV demand when you've got electricity demand in the electricity sector when you've got more EVs in the transport sector. And really that's it. So I'll drop it there, give people a chance to ask a few questions. Obviously significant challenge here. We'll talk about need for greater measures and more detail, but ultimately it comes down to what everyone's been saying this morning, implementation. It's been highlighted globally, and it's an issue here too, and something we need to address. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and I'll invite Stephen to take a seat beside me. We're going to, given time, limit the number of questions. I think we have 3 online questions for Stephen, and we'll take those and then maybe break.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of for Stephen and yourself, Brian, as well. So the first one that comes up here is how are we planning nationally to deal with any surplus emissions that aren't reduced as per the Climate Bill target, the Climate Action Plan objectives, or the sectoral targets? Like if energy falls short of its sectoral targets, do the remaining emissions get carried over to the following carbon budget period for energy, or are they distributed equally among other sectors to pick up the slack?
I can take that question. I mean, if there is a shortfall in terms of meeting a target, it is carried forward into the next budgetary period on an economy-wide basis, and a decision can be made in due course as to what the best way to distribute the effort is for the second carbon budgetary period.
Brilliant, thanks. And then sort of an overall one of what impact are the ever-increasing sales of SUVs at the moment and the heavier vehicles having on WEM and WAM in the model projection?
Stephen.
Yeah, well, I mean, the fleet that we're using for the projection is based on current fleet projections as well. So it is, to the degree that it's happening already, it's captured in the projection. It's an interesting one because it could go either way. If you've got SUVs being replaced, diesel or petrol SUVs being replaced by electric SUVs, it's got a benefit in one sense. But ultimately, heavier vehicles have more materials in them. Globally, there's more emissions associated with producing them. They produce more tire and brake dust and so on in terms of air pollutant emissions and time in cities. So yeah, it's something we try to capture. It's a measure that people will have noticed that most of the new EVs for sale are SUVs because that's the category that's in growth, and that's where the profits are obviously there for the manufacturers. But it's yes, I would say it's unclear exactly yet as to what the trade-off will be between the reduced SUV diesel emissions versus the other knock-on effects on air pollution and the global issue with producing heavier vehicles.
Thanks. And then another one on kind of nature-based solutions and bringing them in going forward. So this one it's quite wide-reaching as well, but given widely acknowledged health benefits of green infrastructure, such as trees and woodlands, to climate resilience and the health and well-being, especially as we saw during COVID-19, if it's so important, why is there no adequate investment? Why do you feel there's no adequate investment in Ireland into urban forest strategies on a statutory basis? And we'll go from there. Thanks.
Look, on that one, I think the Climate Action Plan 2021 sets out very clearly the important role of nature-based solutions. It sets out ambitions to achieve an annual afforestation rate of 8,000 hectares. It sets out policies which are already underway in the Midlands, where Bord-na-Mona has transitioned to being a nature-based solution semi-state company re-wetting bogs. So, I mean, the person who posed the question is right. Nature-based solutions have a really important role to play, and I think we are bringing forward policies to accelerate and drive those types of solutions to underpin the transition we need to make. So look, at that point, I think given time, I said we'd take 3 questions. We'll finish this morning's session. Thanks, Stephen, and all the other speakers for this morning. Coffee break now. It's back at 11:45.